I'm reading poems from Zoom, and this is one of the first editions. In fact, it's the book I've had with me since it first came out, and it's got all my notes written in it, which are unrepeatable on camera. And I'm just flicking through, looking for poems to read. This is a poem called The Stuff. I worked for 7 or 8 years as a probation officer in Manchester, and there are perhaps a dozen poems in this book that come directly from that experience, and perhaps another dozen which indirectly draw on those days. At the time it was mainly drugs work. There was a big heroin explosion in Manchester, and so it was very serious and in some ways deadly serious. But one thing that was hard to take seriously about it was the language that came with the substance. It just didn't seem to fit very comfortably in people's mouths. So I tried to position this poem somewhere, where sort of Coronation Street meets Miami Vice. It's at that junction. The Stuff. We'd heard all the warnings, knew its nicknames. It arrived in our town by word of mouth and crackled like wildfire through the grapevine of gab and gossip. It came from the south, so we shunned it, naturally, sent it to Coventry, and wouldn't have touched it with a barge pole if it hadn't been at the club one night. Well, peer group pressure and all that twaddle, so we fussed around it like flies round shite, and watched and waited till one kid risked it, stepped up and licked it, and came from every pore in his body. That clinched it. It snowballed, whirlpooled. Listen, no one was more surprised than me to be cutting it, mixing it, snorting and sniffing it, or bulking it up with scouring powder or chalk or snuff or sodium chloride and selling it under the flyover. At first we were laughing. It was all right to be drinking it, eating it, living and breathing it, but things got seedy. People went missing. One punter surfaced in the ship canal having shed a pair of concrete slippers. Others were bundled in the back of vans and were quizzed, thumped, finished off and dumped, or vanished completely like Weldon Keys, their cars left idle under the rail bridge with its cryptic hoarding that stumped the police. Oldham, home of the tubular bandage. Others were strangled, not that it stopped us. Someone bubbled us, CID sussed us and found some on us. It was cut and dried. They dusted, booked us, cuffed us and pushed us down to the station and read us our rights. Possession and supplying. We had it. We'd had it. In court, I ambled up and took the oath and spoke the addict side of the story. I said grapevine, barge pole, whirlpool, chloride, concrete, bandage, station, story. Honest. This is the first poem in the collection. It's called Snow Joke. So I think of this as sort of entry-level Armitage. For readers and for the writer, I think all my writing goes back to my parents' house, perched up on the side of the hill, looking down into the village. And when I looked like that. And he used to watch all the cars coming up from Huddersfield along the A62, come up through a sort of flight of villages. And this was back in the days when the weather was proper and it would snow in the winter. And the council put some lights down in the village, red flashing lights. And if they were flashing, there was a big sign underneath saying, "You can't get over the moor. It's closed, there's a blizzard, it's dangerous, turn round." And most people did turn round, but occasionally somebody would pull up in their car, stop, see the lights, read the sign, and then just carry on. And I was very interested in that mindset, where that person had got to in their life, who just decided to plough on. Snow Joke. Heard the one about the guy from Heaton, Mersey. Wife at home, lover in Hyde, mistress in Newton-le-Willows, and 2 pretty girls in the top grade at Wearmouth Prep. Well, he was late and he had a good car, so he snubbed the police warning light and tried to finesse the last 6 miles of moorland blizzard, and the story goes he was stuck within minutes. So he sat there thinking about life and things, what the dog does when it catches its tail, and about the snake that ate itself to death. And he watched the windscreen filling up with snow, and it felt good, and the whiskey from his hip flask was warm and smooth, and of course there isn't a punchline, but the ending goes something like this. They found him slumped against the steering wheel with Volvo printed backwards in his frozen brow. And they fought in the pub over hot toddies as to who was to take the most credit. Him who took the aerial to be a hawthorn twig, him who figured out the contour of his car, or him who said he heard the horn moaning softly like an alarm clock under an eiderdown. This is another poem which I wrote, while working in Manchester. It's called On Miles Platting Station. I don't think there's a station there anymore. I mean, there was barely a station there when they said there was a station there, and part of that is in the description. And then eventually it starts to talk about the Hindley Brady murders and the shadow that was still falling across that part of Manchester where I was working so many years later. Where I live, up in the Pennines, the moor just above the village is where those bodies were buried, and they sometimes go back up there looking for yet another body, but you can't remember the same place twice up there. It's incomprehensible as a landscape. On Miles Platting Station, the stitchwork has done well for itself, clinging as it must to the most difficult corners of near derelict buildings. In the breeze, a broken cable mediates between the stanchions, and below the bridge a lorry has jackknifed, attempting to articulate an impossible junction. This, after all, is only a beginning. After the long chicanery of the express train picking its way across the fish plates, we will rattle backwards through the satellite towns. From Greenfield, we will fail to hold our breath the length of the tunnel, then chase the sixpence of the entrance and burst the surface of light just over the border. It will be the hour after rain. The streets will shine and the trees bend, letting their soft load. Until then, the platform holds us out against the townscape, high enough to see how Ancoats meshes with Beswick, how Gorton gives on to Hattersley and Hyde, to where Saddleworth declines the angle of the moor. Somewhere beyond that, the water in Shiny Brook spills like a broken necklace into our village. The police are there again, box-hauling the traffic, adjusting the arc lights. They have new evidence tonight, and they lift it from behind the windbreak, cradle it along their human chain, and lower it carefully down into Manchester. Ivory. No more malarkey, no baloney. No more kerfuffle or shenanigans. All that caboodle is niet dobra. It will end this minute. No more fuss or palaver. No more mush or blarney. No flowers by request. No offence meant and none taken. No more blab. None of that ragtag and bobtail business or ballyhoo or balderdash. And no jackassery or flannel or galumphing. Listen. From this point forward, it's 99 44% pure, and no remarks from the peanut gallery. A lot of my titles at the time, and still occasionally now, are taken from songs. So the 80s, 90s is a song by the Fall. Well, a song might be a strong word for it. It's a track by the Fall. Yeah. 80s, 90s. Firstly, we worked in laughable conditions. The photocopier defied definition. The windows were sealed with a decade of paintwork. The thought of a cigarette triggered the sprinklers, and the security door was open to question. Any excuse got me out of the office. I found the letter in the pending folder, a handwritten thing signed T. Ruth O'Reilly on a perfumed leaf of watermarked vellum. It requested recognition, or maintenance even, from a putative father, one William Creamstick, who was keeping stum in the Scottish borders. At midnight, I took the decision to risk it. I darned the elbows of my corduroy jacket, threw a few things in an old army surplus, and thumbed it to Ringway for a standby ticket. At dawn, I was still going round in circles in a 5-mile stack over Edinburgh airspace. I accepted a lift to Princess Street Gardens from an aftershave rep who slipped me some samples. It was Marie Celesteville in the shopping centre, so I borrowed a pinter from the library doorstep and a packet of rusks from the all-night chemist, then kipped for an hour in the Cash Point lobby. Creamstick's house was just as I'd pictured. Pigs in the garden, geese in the kitchen. He was toasting his feet on the coal-fired Aga as I rapped the window with my umbrella handle, and he beckoned me in, thinking I'd come to spay the bitches in his sheepdog's litter. He listened, nodding, as though I were recounting the agreeable facts from another man's story. Then, producing a bread knife the size of a cutlass, he suggested, in short, that I vacate his premises and keep my proboscis out of his business, or he'd reacquaint me with this morning's breakfast. In a private wood on the way to the trunk road, I stumbled on a fish farm, and beyond its embankment was a fish that had jumped too far from the water. 2 more minutes of this world would have killed it. I carried it, drowned it, backstroked its gills till it came to its senses, disappeared downwards. Back at head office, they were all going apeshit. Hadn't I heard of timesheets or clearance or codes of conduct or agency agreements? As I typed out my notice and handed my keys in, I left them with this old tandem to ride on. If you only pay peanuts, you're working with monkeys. It ain't what you do, it's what it does to you. I have not bummed across America with only $1 to spare, 1 pair of busted Levi's and a Bowie knife. I have lived with thieves in Manchester. I have not padded through the Taj Mahal, barefoot, listening to the space between each footfall picking up and putting down its print against the marble floor. But I skimmed flat stones across black moss on a day so still I could hear each set of ripples as they crossed. I felt each stone's inertia spend itself against the water, then sink. I have not toyed with a parachute cord while perched on the lip of a light aircraft, but I held the wobbly head of a boy at the day centre and stroked his fat hands. And I guessed that the tightness in the throat and the tiny cascading sensation somewhere inside us are both part of that sense of something else. That feeling, I mean. This is the title poem, Zoom. And I took the idea from a Canadian cartoon called Cosmic Zoom, which zooms in, it's an animation, into somebody's arm and down into the subatomic, and then zooms right back out into the depths of space, and it was a sort of circular journey. It looked the same at both ends, and was very meaningful to an impressionable young man. And I think it just celebrates that idea of poetry being a great vehicle, a machine that can take you from, here to the edge of the cosmos in just a line, and celebrates the idea that it's something that we all have. It's a free language, and it's a free gift. And there's a line in the poem which I stole from an early Human League album. You can see I had very high literary coordinates at the time. And the supermarket mentioned is Sainsbury's supermarket in Huddersfield. If you're ever in West Yorkshire on a literary pilgrimage, that's where you should make your way to. It had just arrived, the supermarket in Huddersfield, and it was a source of great curiosity and conversation. We'd all go down there and have a look at an avocado. Zoom. It begins as a house, an end terrace in this case, but it will not stop there. Soon it is an avenue which cambers arrogantly past the Mechanics' Institute, turns left at the main road without even looking, and quickly it is a town with all 4 major clearing banks, a daily paper, and a football team pushing for promotion. On it goes, oblivious to the planning acts, the green belts, and before we know it, it is out of our hands. City, nation, hemisphere, universe, hammering out in all directions until suddenly, mercifully, it is drawn aside through the eye of a black hole and bulleted into a neighbouring galaxy, emerging smaller and smoother than a billiard ball, but weighing more than Saturn. People stop me in the street, badger me in the checkout queue and ask, "What is this? This that is so small and so very smooth, but whose mass is greater than the ringed planet?" It's just words, I assure them, but they will not have it. Yeah, it's a strange business looking at those poems. I don't think I see them as belonging to somebody else necessarily, but I remember that stage of transition and the idea that the life of a poet was opening up to me, which seemed preferable to the life of a probation officer, but kind of risky as well in the sense that there weren't any guarantees of any kind attached to it. But I see in those poems an innocence as well, and I think a good number of them were written without any hope of publication. Didn't think of myself as a writer at that time. I just saw myself as writing, and I recognise that the lifestyle and the attitude. And I think once you have been published, all that by necessity changes. You start thinking about books and not just poems, and you start thinking about readers and the presentation of your work, the transmission of it. But I think in those early days it was just between me and the page and a few friends that I was sharing the work with. And I've had opportunity to go back and change those poems, and there have been reprints and selecteds and things like that. But I like the idea that they are a record of the best that you could do at that time. And in some ways I see them as diary entries and journal entries, and I don't think it's right to go back and start a sort of process of falsification. There is one thing I've changed. I remember when I submitted the manuscript, I had a bit of a discussion with Neil about a grammatical point in one of the poems. It's this line here: "On it goes, oblivious of the planning acts." And Neil insisted that the correct word was of, not oblivious to the planning acts, oblivious of the planet. So oblivious of it was. But when I read it, I always say to.
But you were published in a lot of small magazines, and you had pamphlets and so on for a couple of years before the book, weren't you?
I was published in magazines, and I think I've been very active in getting work into magazines. But the idea of poems appearing in something called a book still seemed like a quantum leap from that activity, which was quite local and small scale, sort of lo-fi publishing.
How old were you when Zoom came out?
Well, it was published in 1989, so I was 3, yeah. Child prodigy.
Because that picture, you look like a schoolboy.
Yeah, I was. It came out in '89, so I was born in '63, so I was 26. I mean, it's so odd now thinking back. I mean, when I talk about it, I sound like I'm talking about the 1860s or something. But the internet's made such a difference to absolutely everything. So one radio interview, one appearance on TV could make a huge difference at the time. That was enormous exposure. And also just the idea that you couldn't get stuff. This book is constructed out of references and coordinates and the sort of my pantheon of gods at the time, with a selection of books that I happened to have, not that I wanted to have. It was what the local bookshop sold, or you could get in the local library. Beyond that, it was really difficult, and that change that's occurred, where we now live in an age where you can get anything, everywhere, all the time. Your reading at that time, and therefore your writing, was just directed by availability, which was very coincidental. And I recognise influences in that book, which just happened to come about because somebody would bring a book into the writing group, or the library happened to have it, or Greenhead Books in Huddersfield for some reason happened to have it in their extensive poetry section underneath the drama section.